Okay, so this is a video I've wanted to make for a while, to be honest. I think it's a really interesting discussion. I think some people see it as black or white, and I don't think it is that. I think it's very much a grey area. And given the news cycle that's happened over the last week or so, Rupert Lowe highlighting again the fact that he would be willing to bring the death penalty in if Bristol government took over, and the people who voted for them wanted that. I thought, what a better time to actually make this video, and we can hopefully have a discussion about it. So, as I mentioned, I think this is a super grey area because even myself, I fall somewhere in the middle of whether I want this or I'm against it. So I guess I'll start with, the pros side of it, if you want to say that. But the instances where I think the death penalty, in my opinion, is actually a valid way to dispense justice, because just putting someone in prison, I don't think for certain crimes is enough. They'll just spend their life. Granted, they won't have their freedoms, but they will have food every day. They'll have a chance to do exercise. They'll be able to do hobbies. And let's be honest, for some of the monsters that we have seen throughout the history of the UK and the world, they just simply don't even deserve that existence, in my opinion. And to me, there's a couple of examples that you can think of that instantly come to mind that are kind of gilt-edged and deserve the harshest punishment. And the obvious one is, of course, Axel Rudikabana. Anyone watching this video will, of course, know the horrendous crimes he committed against those poor, defenceless children, and has clearly since shown no remorse. In fact, in prison, it's reported that he's attacked guards with boiling water. So even though he's gone into prison, there's clearly no chance that he's changed his outlook. He's just an evil person. And why should we be giving a person like that an existence? I don't think we should. And I think it's so gilt-edged. There's no ambiguity about the guiltiness of him. It's clear cut. He did the crime, and I think he deserves the ultimate punishment for that. There's a couple of others. Going further back in history, you could think of maybe the Moors murderers. More recently, you had the likes of Barry Bonnell, who was a football coach that groomed and essayed over 100 boys. It's estimated 100 to about 120, but I think the numbers would be so much higher because a lot of people who unfortunately get groomed just never even talk about it. So I think that number would be much higher. And then on that same theme, Ian Watkins, who, I mean, if you want to find out the depravity that a human being can go to, just research what he did. I'm not going to talk about it on here because, quite frankly, it's haunting and just pure despicable, and a clear indication that some people are just fundamentally evil. And in these cases that I've mentioned, like I said, no grey area. The guilt is there, and the crimes are so heinous that they should never be given anything other than the maximum penalty. Ironically, Barry Bonnell actually died in prison in 2023, and of course Ian Watkins was murdered in October of 25 by another inmate, so ultimately they did find their justice, but I still think my point stands. And this is where it gets difficult for me, because I think I've outlined just a few examples of someone who you could say definitely deserves this. And I think if you asked 99% of people, they would probably agree with me on that sense. But then in my notes, which I've got for this video, the argument against is so much larger than the argument for. And let me just get into it and explain. So the first one for me is, what if this gets into the wrong hands? And what I mean by that is, you might think that Rupert Lowe is a very upstanding person and he'll make a great Prime Minister, and maybe he would. Seems like he's a very principled and virtuous man who would wield this ultimate power to unalive someone with fairness and complete neutrality. But where it gets weird and a little bit scary then is if you look to the future, because even if Bristol won and the government took over and they did good for a few years, eventually the golden age comes to an end and a new party will take over, and it could be anyone. And just think the way that Keir Starmer has wielded his power at the moment with the judiciary and how he's enforced that on the native people, jailing people for tweets. Nobody has jailed more people for social media posts than the UK government. And think of all the authoritarian governments that operate throughout the world, and the UK is top of that list by a country mile. It is not even in the same stratosphere. So it shows that they're more than willing to wield their power to get over whatever ideological idea that they have, and are more than willing to use the tools of government to stop any dissidence or any criticism that they feel of their government. And also, another example of Keir Starmer and Lord Hermer is them going after SAS soldiers for stuff that's happened in wars 20 years ago, even longer back, where they're trying to investigate the conduct of the SAS and other services, but mainly the SAS have come under a lot of the scrutiny from the government, and they're digging up everything that they've done during the theatre of war, which their governments had sent them to, by the way, and now they're going back and retrospectively looking at that and attempting to criminally prosecute our own soldiers for stuff they've done during historical wars. Now, I just got to be, level-headed and say that's not to say that atrocities weren't committed, because we've seen that they have been. But actively going back through history, so many years later now, and going through everything with a fine-tooth comb, actively trying to prosecute your own army soldiers is just strange to me. And what if they had the power to be able to unalive someone? Would they then say, well, your war crimes are so atrocious that you deserve this? It's very difficult, and it's a very, very grey area at the moment. And this is why it's so complicated. And I mean, heaven forbid, think of it this way. There could be a time in 20 years where maybe something has happened in the country and it's really gone on its knees for whatever, and some sort of crazy dictator leadership guy comes and just takes over, and then he's got the ultimate power to dispense this kind of justice on people, and you eventually end up where like the Soviet Union was, where they had sham trials, people who'd clearly been beaten up and forced to give confessions. What's to say that in 20 years' time that can't happen, because history has shown us that it can. But moving on from that to my second point, the judges and juries are ultimately the ones that will make this decision, and these can be influenced by many things. They can be influenced by the government that are in charge. The people who employ them, of course, is the government that are in charge, so they can be influenced by that. There are so many things that can influence a human, because ultimately judges and juries are people. People have biases, people can be corrupted, and that is another thing that really worries me, because you have to have 100% certainty if you're going to convict someone and give them this punishment, because if there is the slightest bit of doubt, I don't think you can ever dispense the death penalty on someone, because even if you're 99% sure, there's still that 1% that means that person could effectively be not guilty. Even recently, there's an example of the Manchester Airport brothers. I'm pretty sure that everyone by this point has seen the clip of them basically in a brawl with the police. And while the younger brother was convicted, the jury couldn't come to a verdict as to whether both brothers were guilty of assaulting the male police officer who was involved in the brawl in the airport. And then that didn't just happen once, that happened with two different juries. There was two full trials. With the evidence, it is all on CCTV camera, and they could not come to a unanimous decision. So what is the reasoning behind that? Well, I don't know because I wasn't in the room. But the point being is, even when the evidence is there and you can watch it and you can actually see exactly what happened, two groups of jurors couldn't come to the same conclusion, which puts the neutrality of some people who would be on juries in doubt. Because again, humans and people have opinions. And if a judge or a jury is making this decision, then they will have a bias and an opinion, which is exactly where it gets difficult again, because that is a huge grey area. And I want to finish on this point because I think this is the most important point of all of them. And that is the system is biased. And all through history, up to the modern times, there is so many examples of this. And I've got just three, but I could have gone on for so long. But I'll just go with this three, which just instantly stuck out in my mind. And this one is a famous one from America, and that is of the Central Park Five boys who got accused of brutally attacking an R-word in a jogger in Central Park. And the police went out and arrested 5 young lads from 14 to 16 years old. And they were all black, and with basically no evidence, and even some of the boys had alibis. All 5 were convicted, and some went to juvie, some went to actual prison, and they served between 16 and 13 years, all serving different sentences. But they were ultimately all completely exonerated when DNA evidence took a step forward, and they were able to find the actual person who did this attack, and he eventually confessed. I think it was around 2002. But by that point, it was too late. The damage had already done. They'd served their terms. They'd struggled through life. They'd lost their childhood and some of their best years because police were biased against a certain group of minorities, and they just decided these kids were going to be the ones they were going to pin it on, and that's the way it happened. Thankfully, now these men have been exonerated. They're now known as the Exonerated Five, and have now moved on to do things in their adult life, thankfully. And then there's an example closer to home, ironically enough, called the Cardiff Five. And this was a case where a young lady called Lynette White was pretty brutally murdered. And even though the police had evidence pointing in different directions and actually away from these 5 men, South Wales police shifted their focus solely onto them. And again, they were black and mixed race men. They were all arrested. They were grilled and for days on end, and in an attempt to get a confession out of one of them, or a false confession, out of one of them. And eventually, thankfully, 2 were acquitted. But even though there was no evidence, the evidence they had was very flimsy. 3 of the men were unfortunately sentenced to life. Thankfully, a few years later, due to DNA evidence moving forward again, they found the real killer. And again, these men were exonerated. But the whole episode kind of ruined their lives anyway, as you can imagine. So the exoneration, of course, was great, but it doesn't undo the damage that was caused by this bias and this falsifying of evidence. And then this is where you've got to really rub your eyes and think, have I read this correctly? Because in 2011, multiple of the former South Wales police officers that were involved in this case were put on trial for both perjury and preventing the course of justice. But the trial actually famously collapsed because the prosecution mistakenly believed that key documents had been shredded. So the documents that were going to be able to hold these police officers to account were apparently accidentally shredded, which, in and itself is just disgraceful. But it gets actually worse at this point, because the paperwork was actually later found intact, but they never took those officers back and to court, and those officers were never criminally convicted, even though they found the evidence to prove that they had done the perjury and prevented the course of justice. So it just shows, and it goes to my point of how corrupt the system can be. Now, kind of going off the point I started with this video with, was the Henry Novak murder, and the fact that the police, clearly when they turned up, they had the call that there was a racist incident and a racist attack, and they went there with that bias in mind, and when they got there, they made no attempt to hear both sides. They found poor young man, or what seemed like unconscious, as you see from the body cam footage, is extremely harrowing, of a man that is basically on the floor, and he can't even sit up under his own power, and he's telling them that he's been stabbed and that he needs help and he can't breathe and he needs them to call an ambulance. They don't check him over. They in fact slap the handcuffs on him, and then he subsequently, unfortunately, passes away in police custody as they're reading him his rights, basically. It's just absolutely disgusting, and it just shows that the bias goes from one way to the other. Historically, it was against minorities, and there's absolutely no debate to be had there. But now the debate is definitely being had, is it gone and swung the complete 180? Because as it seems like, the precedent of someone saying they were racially abused seemed to take over the fact that there was a young man lying on the floor saying he's been stabbed, and the policeman's response to that was, "I don't think you have, mate," which has now shown a light on the fact that the guidelines for the police seem to encourage them to treat certain groups of people differently. There's a very big debate going on about that at the moment, and it is a very hot debate at the moment. And also, if I could just offer my opinion for another thing, I don't think this is an indictment on the Sikh community. Granted, I don't think any religion or culture should be allowed to carry a weapon, whether it's ceremonial or not, but that's a different discussion, another one that is going on at the moment. But Sikhs have always integrated into the British culture, have contributed. They're a very generous and welcoming people, and they have a long history of serving in the military for Britain. And I think this anger that is whipped up is not actually anything necessarily to do with the Sikh community. It's to do with the fact of the two-tier system, which allowed one man to say, "I've been racially attacked," which led him to be treated completely different to a man who was telling them, "I've been stabbed." It's just a perfect example of the different ways that different groups of people get treated. And I think it's the frustration with the system of the police and the government all mixed together, and that's where the anger comes out. So in conclusion, given everything I've outlined, this is where it's a grey area, because there is some instances, as I highlighted at the beginning, that the death penalty would probably be the correct thing to administer. But everything that I've explained since that really, in my opinion, just puts so much doubt in your head as to whether it's the right thing to do, that for now at least, given the current situation that we live in, I personally wouldn't back the death penalty coming back, but I can also understand why people do want it to come back, because sometimes it does almost feel like some people get away with committing the most monstrous crimes ever just for them to live their life at the expense of us as the taxpayer. But let me know what you think, and I will catch you later.